Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly.
Today, I want to begin by acknowledging the elephant in the room. The conservative movement is in flux. It's in flux because of the systemic failure by conservative leaders to do what any good leaders must do: define and maintain the foundations of that movement. This is our job. If we care about conservatism, if, as Heritage Foundation proclaims, our goal ought to be to formulate and promote conservative public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense, then we must stand up against those who would pervert and twist the conservative movement into a movement without principles, or worse, a movement that promotes the very opposite of the principles that conservatives hold dear. So let me begin with a non-controversial statement. A country without borders is not a country. America, for example, is a country. It is a country with certain ideals embodied in the Declaration of Independence, with certain governmental structures embodied in the Constitution of the United States, with a certain culture rooted in Judeo-Christian thinking and springing from Anglo-American traditions. If America does not protect its borders, America ends. A country without a border is no country at all. If we take in millions of people out of sympathy, and those people fail to assimilate to our values, then we lose our character as a country. And if we choose as our leaders those who would effectuate and champion this sort of perverse policy, we betray ourselves and our country. Now, let's discuss the conservative movement. The conservative movement also requires a border. A conservative movement without a border is no conservative movement. We are a welcoming movement, but those who seek to undermine the character of conservatism must never be granted legitimacy as voices of our movement. Conservatism requires ideological border control. American conservatism is a term with a definition. We use terms because they have meaning. Definitions, by nature, delimit, they distinguish. And the term American conservatism has a meaning. That meaning is embodied in the Heritage Foundation's mission statement. Let me read it again, more slowly. Quote, the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. Those who oppose those principles definitionally oppose American conservatism. That is just definitional. Such people are not ideological allies. They are not part of the rich debate that is constantly ongoing between various strands of conservatism. They are opponents, and they ought to be treated that way. Which brings us to Tucker Carlson, who has become, by any honest assessment, an opponent of conservatism, an outsider masquerading as an insider, and destroying the character of the conservative movement in the process. Let me begin with free enterprise. Free enterprise is rooted in the idea of private property, and private property is rooted in the idea of man as a creative agent made in the image of God. John Locke, one of the great influences on the American founding, explained, quote, every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever he then removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. From private property springs the system of the free market. Free markets are rooted in the simple recognition that if I own my property, I ought to be able to trade it, dispense with it, or invest it, as I see fit, so long as those decisions do not infringe upon the equal rights of others to do the same. Free markets are just, because justice requires that we each ought to have the same right to the advantage of our natural abilities. The alternative is tyranny. Tucker Carlson has unending critiques of the free market. Mirroring Marxist thinkers of the past 2 centuries, Carlson argues that the free market is inherently dehumanizing. Appearing on my show in 2019, Carlson said, quote, I'm not a socialist, but I'm totally fine with the comparison to Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders on this one specific point. Is the goal of our economy to serve the people who live here, or are the people who live here merely units of production in a global economy? If you believe the former, then you're on my side. This, of course, is a false choice and a classic straw man. people are both economic actors and also citizens of countries. But to posit the two in opposition is inherently to stack the deck against capitalism. There is no limiting principle at all to the idea that the economy is directed to, quote, serve the people who live here. Centralized control is rooted in precisely this idea. The economy is designed to protect the rights of individuals, and speaking collectively about the economy in this fashion is a quick road to collectivism, which presumably is why Tucker has called for banning self-driving trucks and high credit card interest rates and mergers that include layoffs, why he has called venture capitalists vulture capitalists and maligned Bill Ackman as a useless person motivated by amoral greed, why he has suggested that any venture capital firm that buys a failing firm and sells off its assets and shuts it down should actually be made illegal. It is why, presumably, he has praised left-wing figures ranging from Elizabeth Warren to Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez to Zoran Mamdani. It is why Tucker Carlson says, quote, the main threat to your ability to live your life as you choose does not come from the government anymore, but it comes from the private sector. This is patent nonsense. Perhaps Carlson frequently finds himself having to say that he isn't a socialist because often he sounds so much like one. Of course, Carlson is certainly a capitalist in the most obvious way. He's happy to sell nicotine. Limited government. Limited government is rooted in the idea of individual rights and liberty. Limited government is the flip side of individual freedom, and unlimited government means that no individual freedom can exist. The Constitution, the single greatest governmental document ever framed by human beings, is the embodiment of this idea, of course. To Tucker Carlson, unfortunately, the Constitution is a mere ruse, a sham. Instead, Tucker Carlson promotes a conspiracy theory by which the American people have lost total control of their lives and thus have no real ability to shape policy. Now, this criticism by Carlson is rooted in a fundamental truth. The regulatory state, never envisioned by the founders, has overrun all boundaries, and it has run out of control. The executive branch has become the repository of nearly all policymaking, in a way the founders certainly never intended. But conservatism argues that a return to the traditional structures of checks and balances between the branches and federalism between the states and the federal government ought to be the goal. Tucker Carlson believes that foreign powers have hijacked our government, that conspiratorial elite, immovable and undefeatable other than through centralized power, has taken control. In 2018, Tucker Carlson said Washington leaders have confirmed our country's democracy is fake. If the population starts to believe it's all fake, that they're not really in charge, their votes don't matter, what will they do? Well, what they would do presumably is revolution. Because if our constitutional structures are utterly insufficient, we have lost control. In fact, according to this view, the entire classically liberal structure of our system is wrong. As Tucker Carlson recently put it in his podcast, and this is a direct quote, feudalism is so much better than what we have now, because at least in feudalism, the leader is vested in the prosperity of the people he rules, which is a strange contention to make about feudalism if you know literally anything about the history of feudalism. He said, quote, if all your serfs die, you starve. There's a true incentive to care for those people. Nothing says caring like feudalism. The founders would have hated nothing more than such sentiments. Thomas Jefferson called feudalism an engine of immense oppression. Alexander Hamilton argued that the Constitution was designed to replace feudalism with allegiance to law. John Adams called feudalism a brutal, quote, system of inequity. And they were right, which is why the Constitution is designed the way it is and why conservatives should seek to uphold and strengthen it. Then there is a strong national defense. Obviously, the hallmark of the conservative movement when it comes to foreign policy has been peace through strength for generations. That means a realistic assessment of our interests and our opposition. It means a recognition that absent a strong America in the world, Americans become less safe, less prosperous, and less free. It also means recognizing America's historic contributions to global peace and prosperity. Tucker Carlson recognizes none of this. Russia, for example, is a geopolitical enemy of the United States. To pretend otherwise is idiocy. Alexander Dugin, often called Vladimir Putin's brain, who calls Russia the geographical axis of history and argues that Russia must not be a regional power but an imperial one, has been a guest on Tucker's program. Dugin says that Russian expansion is not a question of living space, but the establishment of a special Russian type of worldview, which is accentuated eschatologically and claims to be the last word in earthly history. America, in the view of Alexander Dugin, is the existential enemy of Russia's vision. This means, quote, the rejection of U.S. strategic control and the rejection of the supremacy of economic market liberal values. As I say, in April, Tucker Carlson featured Alexander Dugin on his show, where he characterized him as, quote, a writer who writes about big ideas, and painted him as a victim of Western powers, while giving Dugin space to call Vladimir Putin, you know, a dictator, murderer, arch opponent of every president that has ever faced him down, quote, a traditional leader who stands strong defending traditional values. And of course, Tucker also interviewed Putin, an interview so soft that even Putin mocked Carlson for it. Carlson himself argues that we ought to ally with Russia. He said that this week. When questioned about Vladimir Putin's brutal history of slaying his political opponents, Carlson answered, quote, leadership requires killing people, while equating Putin's sins with those of America's leaders. Carlson famously traveled to Russia to praise their bread and subways in full Walter Duranty fashion, all while explaining that the average person doesn't care as much about abstractions, meaning democracy, property rights, rule of law, as, quote, the concrete reality of his life. Then, in order to obscure the geopolitical realities of Russian aggression, Tucker Carlson explains that Putin is no threat to Americans. Quote, has Putin ever called me a racist? No, but he has supported regimes throughout the world that threaten North American interests and military forces. He has infiltrated his influence into South and Latin America. He has opened the bloodiest war in modern European history. Those things might be slightly more important to America's foreign policy interests than whether Tucker Carlson has been personally offended by Vladimir Putin's commentary on race. But this is Tucker Carlson's typically anti-American foreign policy, which has become essentially indistinguishable from the thought of far leftists like Noam Chomsky. Venezuela, says Tucker Carlson, is now being targeted by Globo Homo. That's a thing, apparently. It's being targeted by Globo Homo because it is, quote, on social policy, one of the most conservative countries in North, South, or Central America. Never mind that Venezuela, of course, is a communist hellhole that has driven millions of people into exile, flooding America's borders, resulting in mass migration, as well as shipping drugs in the United States to kill Americans. By the way, this is in and of itself an idiotic point. North Korea is also quite socially conservative, but that does not make its regime morally or geopolitically defensible. China, of course, is a geopolitical enemy of the United States, a fact that the Trump administration has admirably made crystal clear in both rhetoric and policy. And yet, Tucker Carlson's frequent guest, Jeffrey Sachs, is an arch-globalist and fan of the Chinese regime, who spends his time talking about the shortcomings of America's foreign policy. And then there's Iran, which Tucker Carlson has glazed repeatedly, even going so far as to have the president of Iran on his program and ask 0 difficult questions, which Tucker admitted, saying, quote, there's no chance he's going to answer honestly. So then why have an interview? Or, of course, Qatar, which Tucker Carlson treats as America's foremost ally in the Middle East, dismissing its financial support for terrorist groups like Hamas, ties with Iran, and anti-American propaganda networks like Al Jazeera. Carlson just announced recently that he's buying a house in Qatar. He said this was to show that he is an American. Really? That's strange because Qatar doesn't allow public displays of Christianity by churches and currently holds tens of thousands of people from foreign nations in slave labor conditions, many of them Christians. Or there's Hamas itself, which Carlson has called a political organization, and whose nefarious propaganda Carlson echoed and continues to echo daily. Carlson, of course, reserves his chief foreign policy ire, unsurprisingly, for Israel, with which he has a peculiar obsession. Unwilling to attack President Trump's foreign policy on Israel directly, he has instead suggested nefarious Israeli influence in American government, up to and including posing a question this week on X as to whether America's current operations against Venezuela are being driven by the Israelis. Which, I mean, no. Carlson says that the people he, quote, dislikes more than anybody in the world are Christian Zionists, whom he says engage in heresy and also have a brain virus. All of this presumably based on his thorough understanding of the Bible, which he admits he first read from start to finish in 2023, 2 whole years ago. And as for America's historic role in the world, particularly since World War II, Tucker has little but scorn. Presumably, this is why he has spent the last several years touring the world condemning America and Britain for fighting the Nazis in World War II, insisting that the West won a Pyrrhic victory in that war and that Winston Churchill was essentially a failed leader. In fact, he calls revisionist pseudo-historian Darrell Cooper, whose sympathy for the Nazi movement and fandom of Holocaust deniers is well cataloged, quote, America's best and most popular historian, and has hosted him repeatedly. And this brings us finally to traditional American values. Obviously, America is rooted in traditional values, biblical values, Christian values, things like the Ten Commandments and church life, and a strong religiously based social fabric. The fundamental biblical value, the one that God holds in high esteem, is, of course, truth. Now, of course, Tucker Carlson agrees with traditional conservatives. He and I agree on issues like same-sex marriage or the evils of radical gender ideology, even though he has downplayed the Trump administration's victories on matters like radical gender ideology as essentially of very little consequence. But on a fundamental level, traditional American values, the biblical worldview, require truth as a priority. Truth is not Tucker Carlson's priority. He likes speculation. He likes conspiratorial question asking. But evidence and truth are not of particular value to Tucker Carlson. And so Tucker Carlson has trafficked in nearly every conspiracy theory under the sun. He has accused the Trump administration of covering up a Mossad-run child sex trafficking ring run by Jeffrey Epstein, without, of course, actually mentioning Donald Trump's name, because Tucker is a coward when it comes to President Trump. He has suggested government involvement in 9/11 only a few years after correctly dismissing that theory. He has cast conspiracist and ambulatory psychotic Alex Jones as a prophet. Not, says Tucker Carlson, a conspiracy nut, a prophet. Alex Jones, it should be noted, is the man who claimed that Sandy Hook was staged, 9/11 was a government-initiated operation, and that more than one of sex rings. In fact, Tucker Carlson has repeatedly hosted conspiracists on nearly every topic under the sun, uncritically nodding at their most bizarre assertions. And unfortunately, it gets worse, because Tucker has also hosted pornographer and accused human trafficker and rapist Andrew Tate on his program to help him dismiss his crimes and to promote his horrific and anti-conservative takes on relations between men and women as self-improvement. And, of course, Tucker Carlson has hosted and glowingly treated America's foremost Hitler apologist, Nick Fuentes. None of it comports with traditional American values. Now, I'm not going to speculate on why Tucker is doing what Tucker has been doing over the course of the last couple of years. I don't know his motives, and frankly, I don't care, because motives are of no consequence. What matters is that he has a gigantic audience, and people listen to him, and he is lying to those people. And he is mostly lying when he says that he is doing all of this in the name of a conservatism that does not resemble actual conservatism in any way, shape, or form. Tucker is a highly talented broadcaster, of course, and that means that many people, millions of people presumably, are being led down a primrose path to frustration, to demoralization, and to enervation. Because here's the thing. If you reject free enterprise, you reject individual initiative. If you reject limited government, you reject individual rights. If you reject a strong national defense, you open the door to America's enemies. And if you reject traditional values, you reject both truth and decency. Tucker Carlson has rejected the central premises upon which conservatism, and therefore America, stand. But the real question isn't about Tucker Carlson. It's about a conservative movement that purports to treat him as a thought leader. A movement without a border is no movement. A conservatism that treats Tucker Carlson as a thought leader is no conservatism. If conservatives do not stand up and draw lines, conservatism and the dream of America itself will cease to exist. It will cease to exist because the conservative movement will have committed suicide. No country can exist without borders, and no conservative movement can exist without principles it will defend against those who would degrade them, even from within. Heritage Foundation has always been the institution defining the contours of conservatism. If Heritage Foundation wishes to retain its status as a leading thought institution in the conservative movement, it must act as ideological border control. It must continue to draw the contours of legitimate, real conservatism. This is what the institution exists to do. Again, ideological border control is not censorship, it is recognition of reality. And conservatism has, above all, one priority, one fundamental idea: truth. Not friendship, not emotive declarations about hidden nefarious forces, not conspiratorial theories backed by little evidence linked with spit and bubblegum. Truth. And here is the simple truth. Conservatism means something. And if we refuse to stand for it and fight for it and defend it, it will disappear. And with it, so will the last best hope of mankind. The alternative is a conspiracism that demoralizes. A conspiracism that argues that our ideals embedded in the Declaration of Independence are insufficient, that our systems embedded in the Constitution frustrate human purpose, that equal rights before the law, that's a sham, and that free markets are a ruse. The reality is precisely the opposite, of course. Conspiracism destroys the American spirit. When Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, he issued a warning. He said, "We've got to do a better job of getting across that America is freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare. It's fragile. It needs protection. That warning remains prescient. If we lose our American spirit, we lose America. And the great lie, the lie that all of our systems have failed, that the Constitution has failed us, the principles of the Declaration have failed us, that free markets are failing us, that strong national defense is merely a form of payoff, that somehow the Constitution and limited government are a complete chimera. If we lose all of that, if instead we move toward conspiracism, we lose the American spirit. We must fight the great lie. That is the great lie, that we are not in control of our own lives, and that nefarious forces beyond our control have twisted all of the institutions that America is built upon and the ideas America was built upon into something perverse. In the book of Genesis, God tells the story of Cain and Abel. Cain brings a sacrifice to God, so does Abel. God accepts Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. We never really find out why. The Bible doesn't say why one sacrifice is superior to another. And Cain is angry. In fact, it was Cain's idea to bring sacrifices in the first place in the book of Genesis. Cain says, why would God participate in this cosmic injustice? Why didn't God choose his sacrifice? And God's answer is simple. He doesn't explain why he did what he did. Instead, he says, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Surely, if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin crouches at the door. Its urge is toward you, but you can master it. We can still master our envy and our sin, because it's that stuff that leads to the conspiratorial worldview that undermines Americanism and conservatism. We can still build. We are the luckiest human beings in the history of the world to be born into this magnificent country, built on the principles that conservatives seek to preserve. That message shouldn't be discouraging, it should be uplifting. It was the promise of America from the very start. It's the promise of America today. It's the promise of conservatism and the promise made by the Heritage Foundation. And that promise only exists if conservatives do our job to draw lines, to create borders, to protect our principles, to defend those principles, to conserve.
But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.